All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the Public Lands Grazing session. I'm Caitlin Glover. I serve as Executive Director of the Public Lands Council in Washington, D.C. And whether I am talking to a group of producers, a group of recreationalists, or any other person who may wonder what we do in the West, I always begin with the discussion that the Public Lands Council is the only organization in Washington, D.C. to do what we do. And we like to be unique in Washington, right? The Public Lands Council serves to represent the rights and interests of federal grazing permittees. So while there are a lot of cattle and sheep producers in this country, there is a small subset in the West whose operations rely and are built on and cultivate this public lands grazing resource. Now, a little birdie told me that at the end of your lunch, you may have seen this map. And when we're looking at the map of the United States, the land use, or how we utilize these acres, varies. There's a significant portion that is cattle production. Of course, there's timber production for all of our hardwood and laminate floors and our building materials. But what we need to remember is that this map, this utilization map, has changed over time. Now, all of these acres in the United States, the vast majority of them are private land resources. So that map, this utilization map, looks a little bit different when you think about Western resources. Now, this map shows you the dark purple where the federal land is in the West. And primarily when we're talking about federal land, we're talking about the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. Now, of course, interspersed in these landscapes, we can talk about the Department of Defense, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and others. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we're really talking about these forested and grassland and rangeland resources that ensure that your beef and lamb and wool production across the country remain stable. And core to the central at the core of this grazing management in the West is this concept of multiple use and sustained yield. And I'm not going to talk to you a lot about it because we'll come back to it at the end. But your panelists today are going to talk to you not only about how grazing supports beef production and lamb production and wool production, but supports all of the other interests that utilize these resources. Your recreation, hunting and fishing, your wildlife habitat, even your carbon sequestration goals are central to the management that happens in that purple area, in that western block. Now, in the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about how these lands came to be, why that purple map looks like it does, why we talk about ecosystem services on public lands, on federal lands, differently than we talk about them for private lands. These lands have evolved over time. Nell's grandfather had a much different landscape management or view than he does now. These landscapes have evolved. These 640 million acres across the West that are now owned or managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, they represent a significant portion of those were described as marginal. Now, without going into the Homestead Act and how homesteads were made in the United States, a lot of these lands weren't settled because they were less desirable. They weren't the crop lands. They weren't able to be irrigated. They were further from water and pretty darn rocky, right? But these, once described as marginal landscapes, are central to the operations of Nels and Brenda and Bob. And so before we get started, I'd like you to hear from them about their operations. We'll begin with Nels Hansen, who currently serves as our Public Lands Council president. He's from my home state of Wyoming. And by all accounts, his operation is pretty darn unique. Nels, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Caitlin. Our operation there, my ancestors settled in the Rawlins area in the 1890s and had multiple pieces of property around over the years. Currently, we're still operating on the ground that they purchased in 1899. We're in they really started being able to block up some ground and build a bigger operation from there. At that time, he was running sheep as a byproduct, but the primary source of income was remount horses. And they did that up into World War II, running a lot of horses and had a lot of sheep out there in that area. Then as horses were moved out of the military, those horses got turned loose, and now a lot of people were dealing with the descendants of those and other ranches now. Back in the early 1900s, prior to BLM, could see an object or a project that needed to be done to improve the operation. So my ancestors built big irrigation reservoirs. They were raising grain and hay out on those high desert country. We operated at roughly 7,000 feet on the slopes of the Continental Divide. But over time, they were already starting to see that the water sources were drying up and going away. So we haven't raised a bale of hay on the ranch since the 1950s. It took it out of production completely, just was inconsistent on the water. So today we've moved out of the sheep business. We got out because of predator controls and labor problems back in the 80s. And now we're a cow-calf yearling operation and continuing to run. And currently my son is running the operation, and I try to stay out of his hair as much as I can. The checkerboard, as you can see here, or I told Caitlin I got to quit calling it checkerboard. There's not enough young people playing checkers anymore. But this is a chessboard. If you're not familiar with that, the yellow sections are BLM, and the white sections are our private property. Some of it is private lease, but for the most part, the black lines are the fence lines. So we run in pretty large pastures, intermingled, and so there's no way to operate anything separate. We can't use our private property separate. And we run on a percentage license. So if the allotment is 50% BLM, 50% private, that's how it's calculated. That's how we pay our fees. And if there's any adjustment made in the carrying capacity of the allotment, for example, on this western allotment over here, there's 24 miles that border two wild horse herd management areas for the wild horses. When we have horses come in, if it gets so serious that BLM says they're going to cut our AUMs, they can do a proportional cut off of our private property too. So it's not just losing BLM AUMs, we lose our private property also. So it's a little different situation. And we've been very successful over the years. We've got a really strong working relationship with BLM. Took a long time to get it built up, but it's working well now. We really have a strange situation in that my range con that I'm working with now, we've been working together for about 30 years. Most people don't get to do 30 months. So the Rawlins BLM has got a lot of buy-in on everything we do on that ranch. But they're notified. We keep them abreast of what's going on. If we see a problem, we throw it on the table right away so that we can sit down and figure out what we need to do to address it. And I'll pass on to the next.
How many acres under that ranch? I mean, I realize half of it's private, but what does that encompass?
About 245,000 acres.
And is that Long Sutter? I see the sign up there?
Yep.
Downtown Long, that's my favorite town of Wyoming.
Well, Nels, I think you show here, right, in this checkerboard, but also you described how changes on your private ground affect your public allotment, and then also how changes in the BLM, they're inextricably linked. They're very, very hard to separate. Brenda, I know that you don't have the same kind of checkerboard situation, but you have those similar resource concerns that don't respect boundaries or don't necessarily recognize boundaries on your operation in Idaho. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we are a cow-calf operation in southwestern Idaho. We are on, we border, our county borders Nevada and Oregon. So we're high desert, And we do, I'm married to a fourth generation rancher from Nevada, but as many ranching families are not able to sustain more than one family on a ranch, I was really glad when his mom made him go to college and we met, because we've been chasing our dream ever since, and that was to own our own place. So we built up our herd and then looked for about 5 years at different ranches, because we needed the grass to match the cows and what they were used to. We've sat in some different meetings this morning that talk about different country, cows that know how to eat snow, cows that know how to, do different things. Our cows know how to make, the herd that we built up was desert grass. They know how to make, good beef product off of low growing grass with high nutrition. If you, like we've talked before, if you send them to Kansas, if we would have had to move somewhere else, we would have had to sell the herd. It's profitability. So we went to that aspect. We ended up in Owyhee County, Idaho, which my husband says is the closest thing to Nevada that you can get, except for it's got water. So we run on BLM. Our grazing association has private land, BLM permits, and state land leases. On our personal operation, we have our private land, some higher country private land, and then the bottom country that we winter on, and then we have our own BLM permits. So one of the things that's unique is we don't have the intensity of the checkerboard that Nels has, but within our permits, we have 40 acres of BLM. We have 80 acres of BLM. So we do face some of the same things that Nels faces if there are changes that come about for that. One of the other things that I think we got lucky in the place we were able to purchase, like I said, we looked at a lot of ranches to match what we were looking for 5 years, and I love looking at country. That's awesome. But when the BLM grazing regs came down and some changes came to our area with that, it was a season of use, and there had been some fall use and some winter use, and we went dates on, hard dates on, hard dates off, and there was no hot season use. So this ranch is a unit with our grazing association and our private lands. We utilize the BLM permits in the spring. Then we're off for the hot season in the high country. And we have been able to work with our BLM to get some fall use. But those are some changes that are a little bit different from Nels, but that has to make our ranch work as a unit. If you take the component out, you've got a big hole in the place, and you've got your costs go up. We used to put up hay. We found that we can better manage our grass, and our meadows do a lot better if we bring in a higher protein substance of alfalfa, which we don't grow. We have meadow grass hay. We do cut some hay for horse hay and such. But we do some intensive grazing on those pastures, and we save some for the winter so that we can manage our feed costs, and that's how we're able to work through that. We also shifted, which took, when you are selling calves at a certain time and that's your income for the year, we decided that we could do some management by holding over our yearlings and having some, they graze differently than the cows do, and it gave us some alternative opportunities on our BLM and our private ground to mix it up a little bit, whether it's a drought year, whether you've got extra grass, that kind of thing. So ours is different in some aspects than Nels, but we have a lot of things the same. And the one thing that is the same is it's all got to work together, or else we're a hobby farm. We're not a ranch.
And Brenda, I think even just the comparison between your operation and Nels' operation shows that there are differences. But allotments and federal land are as diverse as the states and the ecosystems that they span. Your operation is very different than Bob's operation. Your BLM ground is different than your Forest Service ground. So Bob, you're in Montana. Tell us a little bit about what you deal with.
Good afternoon, Caitlin. I'd love to. Good afternoon, everybody. If you picture Montana, right in the middle of Montana, there is a mountain range called the Snowy Mountains. And the main ranch is on the south side of that Snowy Mountains. And we don't have as big allotments as these guys, but we do have an allotment. But we're a cow-calf, and we do some diversified too. Hope one of them works. I just love this, working all these things together. So we border the Forest Service for several miles. And part of that Lewis and Clark Snowy Mountains is a wilderness study area, a WSA. And it's been a wilderness study area for over 40 years. I was thinking maybe they might get something done if you study it that long, but I think they're just waiting and stuff. And what concerns me about that is the management. They won't do any fire or anything like that for control on that wilderness study area, but that baby gets a ripping. And Montana this year is burning up. I tell you what, I've never seen a year like this. It's very humbling. I just pray to God every day that we get some snow and things kind of simmer down. But anyway, we have that wilderness study area, but between the private land and the wilderness study area, there's a buffer zone. And some of that does have some grazing take place on it, thank goodness. But it's also maintained a trail. There's a trail that goes all the way from the west end on our Forest Service allotment to the east end to where the big ranchers that are coming to Montana are. So we're getting more restricted, but we have a lot of public use, multiple use if you would.
The trails for what?
50-inch and under ATVs, snowmobiles, motorcycles, horses. We got the ice caves too, right on our forest allotment. I'll touch on a little bit. One thing that makes it unique about our forest allotment on the west end of the Snowies is there is 2 accesses to the Snowy Mountains. And one of them is my Forest Service, our Forest Service allotment. We're on this all together, our Forest Service allotment. So we have places to unload trailers. We have places to have the dirt bikes. We have all that stuff. Ice caves. You have to walk, but it gets a lot of use. We get a lot of camping, off-road. You find people all over and stuff like that, but to their benefit, I have never come out of that allotment short. So I think I want to set a good example of grazing management. That's one of the things that we do. So what do I consider an opportunity to me as a public lands person, a grazing land manager, is the fact that when these people show up to this trailhead, allotment, or whatever, I want them to see something that is user-friendly. It has good habitat for wildlife, the cows and stuff like that. It's also an opportunity. Here's a lot of stories. When you get people up there and they say, well, there's a lot of cow pies around here. And I said, you ever look at a cow pie? So it's a chance to me to talk to them about what a good cow pie looks like. So pretty soon you're talking about stuff that is grazed, maintains good wildlife habitat, captures a lot of snow and water for our resources and our downstream. One thing we're a little bit short of is water on that thing, and we do own a subdivision right next to it. There's a subdivision that also branches off of this, but we did buy the first one out just because it had some water, but it's not perfect. But once again, my concern is fire, weeds, people to somewhat, but I think we're at the stage in life we need to tell stories. These guys got some great stories, and I think they can express it to the public in a way that they can understand it. That's why I'm so proud of ESAP with the NCBA, because that's the warm side of cattle management. We can talk about what we're doing to each other. Just like that program, that video this morning with GLC. People want to see what we're doing. I think we get more done expression, that eye contact, than we can with this much paper. But that's kind of what I'm up to. And I want to mention my daughter Kim coming with me to keep me sane. So it is a family outfit.
Well, and that family component is really important because, when we look at the maps of utilization, or we look at the landscapes, or even at your old family photos, right, for your multi-generational operations, you see a pretty significant evolution over time, not just from, the homesteads and then the non-utilized landscapes, but how all of you, how we perceive of these landscapes and their value. Each of you talked a little bit about how things have changed over time. Nels, you've worked with the same range con for 30 years. Certainly you and Cheryl have seen changes together. But as we're looking at these landscapes, because you have been there, and not only you, but your previous family members, what's the biggest change that you have seen over time, both in perceived value, utilization, and all of the other management that shapes where we are now? Nels, I'll start with you.
It was a harder question when you ask it now than when we wrote it. You know, we certainly the demands on the land, or well, it's the demands on the land with increasing public access, public pressure, the motorcyclers, the increased hunting pressure, the growing wildlife populations. We have more mouths out there and a more diverse set of animals using that ground than my dad or my great uncle, any of them ever had to deal with. They quit, as I said, they quit haying because they were seeing that the springs were already starting to drop. The water flow wasn't what it used to be, clear back in the early 1900s. So, you know, certainly we've changed things a lot with the water developments we've put in out there, the trying to get more uniform use on the land, getting these better, more positive rotation systems in place. When I say more positive, we've built more fences, more infrastructure. We used to try to do things without the fences on, and still do in a lot of places. We'll move cattle by turning the water on and off. But you know, we've quite honestly, we've really increased the production of the land from what the ranch was when I took over from my dad, and certainly. We've got the wildlife populations has just skyrocketed. We'll in that westernmost allotment, we never had elk out there. We had some really nice desert deer. We had a lot of antelope. Now we'll winter something in the neighborhood of 150 elk on top of everything else. The easternmost allotment, we'll have a year-round herd of 300 elk in there, and we'll winter, not unusual at all to have 2,000 that come up out of Colorado and all the way across southern Wyoming and circle up there into that area for the winter. So the real extensive increase of pressure on the land from the other users. Now the public coming out, we deal with not what Bob and everybody's been telling me about what you're seeing in Idaho and Oregon and around, but we're getting a small taste of it, a smaller taste of you know, the campers coming out and setting up for months on end, the four-wheelers and side-by-sides going everywhere. And with that checkerboard land pattern, when they throw those gates open, especially on that western end, I have no idea where the next fence is. I know the next fence to the west of me is 50 miles, and that's the highway going from Rock Springs down into Colorado. To the south, it's somewhere down in Colorado. I don't know where the next fence is. When we lose stock out in that country, sometimes that goes a long ways. And it's not unusual. We don't see some of those cows for a year or 2 years till somebody says, oh, by the way, I got your cow. So we kind of a different world. And with, like everybody, we can't get the help that we used to get. So we're not on top of the cattle like we were raised to be. We do use some technology. We use a lot of game cameras with different things like that to keep track of what's going on out there, because there's only 2 of us on that ranch and we can't cover it all.
And Bob, I want you to talk just a little bit about this public access component. You have the access on your lands, but you see, I think you have a front row seat to some of the changes in recreational use, especially with OHV use. That's something 15 or 20 years ago that we really just didn't see. So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of that use and how you have seen or not seen management from the agencies keep pace?
We've seen it from pretty much a dirt trail to now where there's campsites and everything all over. But actually, I think the ground is in better shape than ever, just because we have the opportunity to manage it more. But you know, the only person that likes change is a baby. And the rest of us is going to happen. So you either got to be the change, adapt to the change, or get out of the way. So what I'd like to do is to visit with those people, and it's how you handle them. One thing you don't want to do is get too serious with those guys and get threatening, because you could end up with a bunch of damaged stock. I haven't yet to have a water tank that's been shot up, and I think that's out of respect. And I encourage respect, and I also encourage a lot of communication, but trails everywhere that Nels talked about, we've had forest fires up there. The guys, they have a campfire and they go off and leave it.
Yeah.
And but we've got trash, and I don't know if I should even bring this up, but I will. I was up there one time and found a sleeping bag, one of those stuff bags up there, and I was wondering where the heck that come from. But I went down and hung it on the gate in case somebody was looking for it and stuff. And I was talking to the guy, he said, yeah, they were up there cooking meth, and I thought, jeez. So the more remote you are, I guess the more that they want to do that. But I don't want to encourage that. Want some more about change or just access?
Or both.
I think he's very lucky to have 30 years from one guy. You better buy him a Christmas present or something, I think. We get a lot of agency turnover. We get different people. We get a different thought process. We get a different mentality, We're going to have more people. That wilderness study area, I'm almost resolved to the fact that someday that's going to be a wilderness. It's there's so much power in the backcountry horsemen, anglers. They're just green camels, so to speak. They're underneath an umbrella or something, but there's so many guys poking at the resource or the bull or whatever else, and they got time to do it. They got a lot of money backing them. Another thing for change is get more top-down management, like you get more executive orders or something like that comes in, and those poor guys have been working on it. Things flop over, so you have to go back and start coming toward their agenda. Once again, just like to meet with people on the ground. Create that contact with your resource manager. I've testified at those WSA hearings, but I didn't realize how much opposition there was to having management done on Forest Service. They want it. The perception is, leave it alone, it's great, but you guys, talk about wildlife, we call them indicator species. Mm-hmm. They indicate where the best grazing is. They follow a cow rotation system. They like that regrowth. These guys that want decadent, we've got millionaires coming in and buying this land and chasing all the cows off and said, I want that just perfect for those elk. Well, it gets decadent. You open up those plants and there's one little green thing trying to find some sunshine. And it takes carbon to decompose a lot of that standing decadent forage. When you have a cow on it, you have sunshine availability. I'm kind of getting carried away here. I shouldn't do that. But I love that land and I want to see it to its best of ability. It's also opportunity to show and tell what we do. I could go on.
And I think, all of you have sort of touched on it, and that's, I think where we'll end today too. It's a good bookend. The people, either yourselves who do the management, or your federal agency partners, or your partner organizations as well. And, there are certainly different priorities across groups, but I think one of the things that we've seen is an explosion in organized groups and organized ideologies about how federal lands, how these public lands should be utilized or protected or conserved. And Brenda, I think you have a front row seat in that. I mean, your role with the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership is certainly one of those organizations. Can you, from a partner organization perspective, can you just talk a little bit about why you think, in some of these organized areas, whether it's backcountry hunters and anglers or your conservation partnerships or even the Public Lands Council, why you think we're seeing more of that now, that organization now, maybe than ever before?
Yeah, so I appreciate that, Caitlin, because I think there is a lot of change, and I agree with Bob. I think there's a lot of opportunity. And so I'm going to just backtrack a second to talk about some changes that we've seen. Like I told you our history, we've been on this place for 27 years. We came in and like the rangeland reform, the grazing regs had taken place. Fences were taken out for wild horse herd management areas. We are 60 miles southwest of Boise, so we are an easy drive with an urban rural economy interface. My county is 75% public land, 12% state. So do the math on the taxpayer base. Mm-hmm. So those stories of talking about why you have an open landscape, why you have a working landscape with healthy plants out there, healthy landscapes, healthy watering facilities. We take care of the watering facilities, wildlife benefits. So all of that, Caitlin, has been coming about. And There was a lot of friction when we first got there. We have what we call a sacrifice area for motorcycles and ATVs. It's really but ugly. But it keeps those people there. They can come out and do whatever in that area to teach their kids how to ride motorcycles or ATVs. We also have seen, I swear, that the side-by-sides and ATVs are changing as quickly as the iPhones.
Yep.
They're coming around and everybody wants the newer ones. So in answer to your question, we in the Owyhees started the Owyhee Initiative, which was a conversation. We missed a monument by the stroke of a pen, literally. Utah got it, Idaho didn't. We built a coalition of some of those groups that had been suing us. And the background that I have, the passion that I have, are, our kids, generational, again, our kids are in this. But Public Lands Council helped with that. That was natural to bring those information, that cross-education is what I call it. One of the things that we found is that land is a landscape and it's got to be multiple use. And when you get to the bottom of it, what makes my heart beat fast about moving cows on the back of a horse or raising beef, food and fiber, not just for USA, but for the world, somebody else sees that because they like to go out and watch birds or hunt or rock climb, but it all has to work together, and we're the ones that are there 365. So those coalitions have been, the tension wasn't working, and I think that we've really been able to get some good partners. Your example with Public Lands Council and Safari Club and Ducks Unlimited. In the Owyhee Initiative, we worked with the Idaho Conservation League, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society, some of those that had advocated to just have a wilderness area with very restrictive management. So then fast forward, that experience leads to what I do now with the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership. We brought people to the table, experiences, connect people, connect Public Lands Council, connect landowners with interested people for a public lands day, and try to have those conversations and teach them about cross-education versus confrontation. And I will tell you, I'm the first one to get really irritated when I've got my grandkids and those side-by-sides blow by at 60 miles an hour right in front of where we're working cattle. But if I can stop somebody and talk to them about what we're doing out there, it makes a good aspect. So those coalitions, I even hate to bring up the word COVID, but the increase that we saw with people getting back to nature, back out and finding out what we already know, how cool it is to be part of that land. It's more important to share those stories and why a working landscape is a healthy landscape. Like you said, Bob, when you take that production out, that's not a healthy landscape, that's a fire waiting to happen. Yeah. And so I think that those coalitions are more important now because we are more efficient with less producers. And we need those coalitions to help tell our stories and understand that cross-education.
Yep.
I'd like to make a comment along with Brenda there. She kind of brought me in the line there a little bit. When I made that comment about the backcountry hunters and anglers and stuff, there's way more positive conservative groups out there than there are negative. And we got to work with those people. And I welcome the chance to work with, did a lot of work with Nancy and her crew and those guys. It's pretty good to have them out on the land.
Yeah.
And I think this partnership, this idea of partnership, one of the things we wanted to talk about today is a little bit about how we got here, right? Why we talk about federal lands ranching, why we talk about the platform and the utility of these public lands. And certainly the landscape and the people are an incredibly important component of that. These are the people who have been on the land along with their other 22,000 grazing permittees across the West. But it's not just your Western landscape, right? Think back to that big map, that purple concentrated area. The purple bits that you saw in the east are typically national parks, right? They're national wildlife refuges. They're not typically grazing lands. But one of the things that I think is incredibly important to talk about is not only the landscape and the ethos, the changes that we've seen and where we are, but the impact that it has on the rest of the producers in the room, right? So we're going to shift gears a little bit to the next section. And yeah, Tim, go on ahead.
Back to what they just discussed, Nichols. So, well, that's all I understand is maybe people in the room go, checkerboard, you haven't got any control over the trespass, like they say in recreation hunting, it's big in Wyoming. So people come out there and go hunt antelope, and they turn at Walmsutter either direction. They're gonna hunt your private land because they can't tell the difference between that and the public BLM, correct? So your hunt deal, you can't control. Can't control the trespass or the hunting.
No, it's really, really tough. We've tried a number of different things on the operation. We've got one allotment on the east end of the operation that we work to deal with a local hunter guide service. And part of the deal was that they had to keep the prices for the locals down low and reasonable, and we keep a minimal hunt off of there, so and mostly on the deer, trying to get the deer herd to come back again to get some quality animals in there. At first, when we started that, we had a lot of pushback, but after about 3 years, then we started having a lot of those hunters, local hunters that were pushing back against us, coming in and say, we're happy to pay because now there's some quality animals out there to go hunt, and I can take my kids out and not have to worry about getting shot. So we really struggle with that one, how to walk that tight line there. Some of the other parts of the outfit, on the western end, we signed an agreement with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for what they call their hunter management program. And we put some parameters on there, what we want people to do and what we don't want people to do. And the Game and Fish oversees the access. They issue the access permits and everything. It's all signed. So if anybody goes in there without a permit, they have to deal with the Game and Fish Department, not me.
Okay, I didn't know you could control that where that's public land. You can't.
Well, we try. And then I've got another area that we just do a wide open hunt. We do require people to get an access permit to go across the private property, but we don't charge for it. It's a free to go. But we're really struggling with it, and we've got a big question mark coming at us right now because we had a huge portion of Wyoming got recently sold, and the new owners are coming in with different philosophies, similar to what we usually see when somebody from the outside comes in. But I leased some of that ground, and the first thing they did was say there will be no hunting on this private property, period, none at all. And they want me to be liable to patrol it and keep everybody off of it. So we're negotiating on that, but we're going to have some real hard pushes on this thing in the near future. But to what they were saying earlier, this working together with the long time we've been working with the BLM, we've been a part of a couple of different cooperative management programs, a number of different things. So we've done just what they're talking about. We've built relationships with the environmental groups in there that that are truly worried about the land rather than worried about their bank account. And I have yet to have a situation where I take somebody out there, and I've had a number of them that said, we're opposed to grazing, but we came to see what you have to show us. I've yet to go home and have any of those people oppose us after that. We've done a number of things on the ranch that when we went through the NEPA process and set this stuff out for comment, we were expected to get a lot of pushback. The only comment that I know of was one guy when we got an increase in our carrying capacity on the ranch. One young man that I knew there in town, his complaint was that he thought we had enough livestock, we didn't need to make any more money. That was it. We've done 30 years of some projects, some of them pretty aggressive, but we have the buy-in and support of the groups in that area, and I mean statewide. We just don't get any pushback on things that we're doing. So
and I think part of the reason that there is, particularly in your area, I think the checkerboard makes it unique. But I think in both in Idaho and in Montana and some of these other western states as well, because there is this public connection to the American West, this idea of what the West is and what it should be. And I think a lot of times when we talk about why it matters to producers in South Carolina, or why it matters to the guy who lives in a high-rise in New York City, we often use images like this, right, of the Bear Fire in California, where on the right side of the road there was management. You see a little bit of fire intervention, but you see a lot more green forage. And then you see the left side of the road where there was no management, there was no thinning, there was no grazing. And we use images like this to shock and to generate that investment that we have to do something differently. But I think one of the opportunities that we have, and that you specifically have, is to talk about the value not just for the investment in the land, because we'll talk about that, but for food security and for the national industry security. You know, when we talk about the 640 million acres across the West that are owned or managed by the federal government, about 250 million of those are managed for grazing activities. And as you're thinking about some of your own operations, 250 million acres isn't something to shake a stick at, right? I mean, that's a pretty significant swath of land. And so just very briefly, as briefly as you can, talk about what it would mean to your operation specifically, to your cattle or your sheep production, if you didn't have access to your BLM or your Forest Service allotments. What would your operation look like? Bob, we'll start with you.
I'm not impacted as much as these. I've got a lot of opportunities, but I would probably survive, but I'd also lose that opportunity to share with people what we do as caretakers. I think you've heard me say this 100 times, that the greatest renewable resource, just not for our families and our animals, but for our wildlife and water and all that stuff downstairs. If I could regress just a little bit to what Nels was talking about, the checkerboard thing, we got the classic example of that in the Snowy Mountains. And that's when the railroad come through, they had all the checkerboards, and things are happening down there. A lot of money showing up. The Yellowstone Club, the elite of Big Sky, have their own thing. They come up about the, what we call it the Marlboro Ranch. Philip Morris had this ranch that completely built this western town. It was very dang cool. They decided they wanted it. They come and bought it. That's America. You know, you make money, you got that opportunity to buy stuff. Well, they're going to make heliport skiing. And Nels, I heard last week, there's that corner. So far, they can't cross corners. They can't step across on those 640s and those checkerboard things and the crazies, but they're pushing it. Some people even thinking about making a little, it's changed. Remember that change I talked about? We got to be part of it. We got to be a part of it. Would I survive without my I wouldn't like to, but I think we're doing a good job. Like they said, 365. And I think it's a lead in. Another thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is working with those agencies. Do a lot of work with fish and wildlife. We've got a block management program where they've got to sign in, like Nels was talking about. Those kids love that. People love that opportunity to have a place to hunt. Another thing we have what we call a kids ridge. It's about a 2-mile, 3-mile ridge where kids can go hunting on that, and dad can go with them, but the kids can't shoot. Dad can go along and have help. I think that brings a lot of value to what's going on. We're part of the 454 program where we have designated areas where people can have access to and hunt antlered bulls. But we also have areas where family is around the house. We pretty much keep that just for safety reasons. And you know, if you've ever read Tragedy of the Commons by Terry Anderson, it's a pretty good book. Look at that. And if we don't have some management, not only on our federal land, but on our private lands, but on our federal lands, things just kind of go awry. And these guys are taking good care of that land. But I could go on and on. You've heard me 100 times, but I could survive, but I wouldn't want to.
And you know, Bob, I think the unique thing about your operation is that because you have that access component, because you have that public-facing component, that makes you an incredible advocate for those who may have more of a reliance on the ground and the forage and the resources, and more of a larger scale investment in those resources. And Brenda, I think you know yours is one of those stories. What would it mean to you and to Tony and to your kids if you didn't have access to that forage or to those acres?
Yeah, well, you heard one of the things in the capacity, and I guess this is, I tease about knowing when I'm getting up there in age, because past experience is leading me to be able to do the position with the Idaho rangeland conservation partnership that I do, and part of that is back to this cross education, bringing public lands information, bringing the wildlife information. But I think one of the biggest things, Caitlin, when I talk, especially to a room full of producers, is we are getting better at telling our story, and we're about 20 years behind because we have a really cool story to tell. But we're also in ag, it's a very private thing, and you're working hard, and it's just, it for a long time was seen as bragging. So when I move forward, you have to be willing to talk about yourself. This is a business choice. We chose to be in the cow production business. And so I laugh because I just say, could we just do the same thing 2 years in a row? Well, and I say that jokingly, but it's that adaptability, because you have to be willing to change. And one of the things that we look at is we have made some changes. It wasn't cost effective, and it wasn't the best for the ground to hay, like I said. We made some changes with our yearlings. We have a back door. We can survive too. It is definitely not what we want to do. But that traffic that I was telling you that comes out from Boise, it used to be, when we first moved there, it would be on the weekends. Saturday morning, maybe early, and during the hunting season. It's every single day, all year long now. And we get people stopping by all the time, or trespassing because they want to look at an old building or something. And again, I've had to teach myself to use it as a teaching moment and try to approach it that way. But we could sell 5 or 10 acre pieces of our, 3,500 acres, and could retire, but that would change the entire landscape. So if our federal lands were out of there, we would have a hobby. We could do a hobby ranch, but we could not sustain a year-round ranching operation, because it takes all the pieces of the puzzle to make the picture perfect landscape that's out there. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we've got going for us right now, is to talk about that, because people are really talking about water and the health of the landscape and wildlife and hunting and recreating. And the other thing we've got to do is talk about recreation as consumptive use. Grazing is consumptive, hunting is consumptive, and recreation has become a consumptive use because it's become motorized. So we too could survive. It would not be the same, and it would totally change that landscape because of the capacity. It would change the economy. I'm a recovering elected official. I served as a county treasurer there for 12 years. And as I told you, our tax base there, it would totally change the entire economy of that county. And it's the second largest county in Idaho. So there's ripple effects.
Sure.
For us, we'd be able to stand up. We've always backed it. Like I said, it's a business. You've got to be able to have a back door.
Sure.
But it wouldn't be a ranch. It would be a hobby farm.
And Nels, what would it mean to you?
Because of that that checkerboard intermingled land, we would be out of business. And that's not just a threat or exaggeration. I as evidence, I use that the majority of my neighbors, when they retired or whatever happened to them, all those lands got sold off into 160-acre ranchettes. Most people don't realize that when you head down Interstate 80 going west of Rawlins, you look on the north side of the interstate, for a stretch there 60 miles to the west, 20 miles to the north, almost all of that private property is sold off in 160-acre ranchettes. Almost all of it. There's there's a few large blocks out there, and I lease 2 of them. And I got 2 other neighbors out there still operating, and all the rest of it's sold off. All those trailers and junk you see around Red Desert, that's part of it.
And
So we'd be gone. We'd be out of business. We couldn't do it because it's illegal. We would be in trespass If we turned out and said, okay, this is a 50% allotment, we'll cut the cow herd in half, we're gonna run on our private property, can't do that. That's a trespass because it's not fenced. Well, I can't fence it because that's a violation of the Unlawful Enclosure Act, even if you could afford to. So we're done, we're just done.
And so we'll come back to this in just a minute, because I think, among the three of you and among those of you who are producers in the room, I think the question is often, we look at a complication, or we look at a reality, or we look at something that comes our way, and we say, how does this affect me? Well, you've just heard what it would mean not to have access to those public allotments. But for those of you who are producers in the room, I think the other question is, what would it mean to you if these producers, if these 22,000 permittees didn't have access to these federal allotments? And Bob, in Montana, you talked a little bit about those wilderness study areas. You talked about some of those other designations. You have about 100 or 1.8 million permitted AUMs in Montana. You have 17 million acres of public land in your state alone that generates $1.3 billion from the beef industry. The sheep industry is the 8th largest in the nation. I mean, these are not only your state, your neighbors, your in-state neighbors, but this is part of the national economy as well. And so when you look at what your story, your advocacy, not only for recreationalists, but in your leadership role here at NatGLC, what do you think the best story is to tell about these public lands and what it means to a producer here in South Carolina?
Diversion, everything is different. In Montana, let's go back to Montana. You bring it up. Montana is one of those states from the eastern plains to the forested west part. We are so different, so diversified. But I want to go back and reiterate what Brenda just talked about, and Nell somewhat too. You talk about a business deal. Subdivisions is not healthy management of our grazing lands or stuff. It's if you have to sell a subdivision or sell a 40 or something, that's so you can survive. I think we need to take care of these public land managers, these grazing managers somehow, and man up and say, you guys are doing something of value. Everybody said, oh, you're getting that for something, but we're there 24/7, 365, and want to do it. And we want to do it. That's why anytime you get somebody to come back to the ranch and they want to do it, that's value added. So the story to tell, we are of the digital age, and I think you're seeing more. We're going to see some here in a minute. Saw some this morning. We're seeing these 3 to 4 minute presentations that people need to see. Public broadcasting. Look what Burns has done. Look what Burns has done with digital stuff going that way. Need to get the stuff out. We're caretakers. We're caretakers of our investment. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, I think we put a period on the end of that sentence because it's a great transition. We talk a lot at the Public Lands Council about our outward message, right? And often we talk about the public message that we give to those who are in New York City or Chicago or an urban area or even a suburban or rural area who might not be directly engaged with these public lands other than to go hiking or to go hunting or to go take pictures of these beautiful landscapes. All of those other multiple uses that depend on all of the pieces of the puzzle fitting in that big picture, like Brenda likes to say. All right, so how many of you watch Yellowstone or Longmire? Or, yeah, all right. So I am the only one apparently in this room who hasn't watched Yellowstone, which
No.
as a girl from Wyoming, okay, so not the only one. The 2 Wyomingites in the room haven't watched Yellowstone. Great,
I haven't
good.
watched
Well, that's all right. That's all right. But for the purposes of our conversation, that ideal of the American West, that cowboy hat and those wide open spaces, those are the things that the general public values because we have healthy landscapes because of management, because we have healthy wildlife because of management. We have this story to tell. We have this beautiful America to conserve and manage and engage with, largely because those lands that were once perceived to be marginal, just kicked them off to the side, are now central to our national identity. And I realize that, all three of you are probably, sitting and getting a little bit fidgety because you don't like being on that pedestal that I'm putting you on here. But it is important because when we're talking about the beef and the sheep industry in the United States, the advocacy that's needed from other producers, the advocacy that's needed from our partner groups, and even internally for us to tell our own story is really, really important. And so as all of you, as you're conceiving of your management, right? Brenda, you go and do what you do every day. You get up in the morning and you do it, and you don't really talk about it, right?
Well, ain't nobody to talk to.
Except yourself.
Yourself, but when you answer
I
yourself,
suppose.
that's when it gets bad.
That is true. That is true. But as you talk about,
Dog every day.
and as you talk about, and as you have conversations with your dog or with yourself or with your neighbor or your cousin, this concept of conservation is permeating, a lot of what we're doing. You look at this picture, right? There are 3 multiple uses in this picture, and probably more on the other side of that hill, right? You look at this picture, you have wildlife habitat, you have carbon sequestration, you have those big open sky values. And so, as you're talking about and thinking about managing your operations, this concept of multiple use is central, and I had promised that we would come back to it. Nels, you talked a little bit about the HMAs. Brenda, you have HMAs that abut your operation. We've talked about recreation. We just saw some energy production that happens as well. We're managing for all of those things. Let's talk a little bit about some of those other multiple uses. We've talked a lot about recreation this morning, but let's talk a little bit about some of the other more challenging items like the wild horse and burrow management. Now, this concept, you don't have fences right around you, and so some of these designated areas, this sets your operation apart from a private land operation in Kansas or in Oklahoma or in South Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about your role? Your family used to run horses. You now see these horses in designated herd management areas. We've seen populations expand over time. Can you talk a little bit about your role and how you perceive of your role in being part of the solution with this wild horse and burrow situation?
Ooh. Just to stay involved and keep working with the agencies and keep them abreast of what's going on. I do a lot of pictures. I'm also a pilot, so I do, as I'm out checking gates and checking waters with the plane, if I see where horses are breaching the fences, getting in where they're not supposed to be, I report that so that BLM has a running tally of what's going on, at least in our area or the areas that I fly over. We just keep constant contact, trying to keep everybody abreast of what's happening, and then working with the neighbors to try to make sure that we have the common story, and we keep both of us or all of us keep working with the agencies, keep the pressure on. It's not the BLM's not the problem with the horse problem or the Forest Service. It's Congress. There's nothing wrong with the laws that we've got in place. We can manage these horses. I'm not saying eliminate. We can manage these horses the way my dad did, my great uncle and my ancestors. And I saw just a little of it while I was growing up. But those horses were managed all the time. We didn't have a population problem, but we had a thriving herd out there all over that country. It's just gone to pot now that the government took over, and they can't ever get ahead of it. So, and the range is what's paying the price. So we just got to keep the pressure on, keep working with them, keep showing them what's going on, show them how it can be done, keep putting the pressure on them. We had some of the things that directly affected us here a few years ago on that westernmost allotment. We had just 2 or 3 horses. Wild horses that came out of one or both of the management areas that border us. But we had 2 or 3 horses in 3 different pastures, and all of them butted up against our horse pasture. So we had to take our saddle horses, haul them 20 miles to the east down to another place where we could have our saddle horses, not have them at risk of getting in a fight over the fence or going out with the herd, because if they go out with the herd, I can't get my saddle horse back until BLM gets around to coming out and doing a gather. It's illegal for me to go get my horse. So was it a big horse problem? No, we didn't have a lot of horses. It wasn't a real issue from that point of view. But it was a real pain to the operation and a major expense. We're up there and we see a calf that needs a shot. Well, we got to go 12 miles back to the interstate and then 20 miles down to catch a horse and then back again and hope you can find a little bugger. It really adds some pressure and some cost to the operation.
You know, and I think often we talk a lot about, those of us who talk about horses or who sponsor a mare or who know a lot of the stories, right, behind these BLM horses. Often we talk in the big picture. Brenda, you know, you were in PLC leadership at the time when the Public Lands Council was part of this coalition effort called the Path Forward, trying to find solutions for the rangeland, for the horse population, but also for these other multiple uses to prevent that kind of rangeland degradation over time from being exacerbated or being worse than it is now. You know, we have a lot of challenges, right? And when we talk about conservation, we talk about ranchers' role in conserving what we have in these precious resources. Horses and those very public invested issues aren't the only issues. You know, Brenda, can you just talk a little bit, you did a little bit before about designations and wanting to protect or preserve versus conserve. Can you talk a little bit about how it is sometimes both a struggle and a blessing to be able to differentiate what it looks like to preserve or conserve a landscape through monuments or through other designations?
Yeah, Caitlin, and thanks for that question because, you know, it's kind of like the wild horse issue. It becomes an emotionally charged issue versus a common sense and what's really truly good for the landscape. Like the wild horses, you know, there's good management, but when you don't manage, it does damage to the landscape. The same thing can happen with conservation. When we just missed a monument designation, you know, we're very independent in this business. Everybody runs just a little bit different, as you've heard. But all of a sudden you realize that if you want to be that island out there, you're going to be the island that's all by yourself and don't have any help. So we had to pull together, and it was tough, but get these coalitions together and have those discussions. And there were some tough ones. First thing we did was get everybody in the room, and this didn't happen quickly. We met once a week for the first 6 months for 8 hours and had lunch together, and we had to sit by somebody that we weren't necessarily comfortable with. That meant for me, I had to sit next to somebody who had been on a lawsuit against public lands grazing, and I was pretty sure I was just gonna take my marbles and go home until all of a sudden you start realizing they had kids the same age, and at this time, you know, they're reading the Harry Potter books, or they'd seen, and you're like, wow, you're kind of like me, but not really, but kind of. And then all of a sudden that relationship starts building. That's when we decided that we needed that common vision. And I go back to what I said earlier. What made my heart beat fast about living out there and having a business out there might not be the same thing that the person from the Sierra Club, it might not be the exact same thing that they went out there for, but that healthy landscape and the water and the wildlife and healthy plants, because they've been grazed, that's a natural resource that needs that natural, it's like mowing your lawn, you need it to be good. All of a sudden, it's the same end result. So how do you get there? So we had to hammer out, and it didn't come fast. We started in 2001. We got legislation in 2009. It's not a fast process, but we agreed on all the segments of wild and scenic rivers And we agreed on those places that aren't going to get studied for 40 years on what really truly had wilderness characteristics. And guess what? There's still grazing going on in there because we all sat down. So in our little corner of the world, we have resolved those issues through some really hard work, some really tough conversations. When we would get to some really tense moments, we'd take a 15-minute break, everybody would get up, leave the room, come back, and we would read that mission statement, which everybody agreed on was sustainable livestock industry, because it's a whole unit of public land. So back to what you say, there's a place for designations, but if you just come and designate everything, back to your question about what should other producers care about, when people come from Kansas or South Carolina or Florida to the west, they want to see a healthy landscape. They don't want to see the trailers you talked about, or the 160-acre weedettes is what I call them, because they're often not managed. They want to see a healthy landscape, and that's what we help provide for those communities. So you can reach areas that do qualify for that, but it's not everything. And our backyard, every place has its problems. If you go to anybody's yard or flower bed or garden, there's going to be a weed or bad soil. Our backyard's just bigger, so you can't focus on that and create a problem. So I do think there's a place for it, Caitlin, but I think it has to be a thoughtful process, and it's got to be a sustainable working landscape.
So I'm going to take two things away from that, Brenda, that it has to be thoughtful and thought-provoking, and that it has to be sustainable. And Bob, you talk a lot about the public access, right? You talked about the sleeping bag that's left, or the remnants of the public land use of those other multiple uses. And you talked a lot today about the opportunity. It's not all opportunity. Sometimes it's degradation through trash left over. Recreation's important. It's an important component of public land use, but you certainly wouldn't want to put cows or sheep out on top of that. This is an active grazing allotment in Arizona that hasn't been identified for recreational use, and still we see rangeland degradation. Now, Arizona looks a little bit different than your Montana access point, Bob. But when this people component is central to our discussion. And when you go out and you see someone either leaving trash or having an impact, leaving a gate open, parking too close to a range improvement, and you have that opportunity to tell the story or to educate someone, what message do you share with them?
Right up front, I welcome that question, Caitlin, thank you. And go back to Brenda's thoughts here a little bit about value added, working with other people like that. The real story on our Forest Service allotment, I was leasing the place right next to it, and the movie Heartland was produced right there. I took those guys over to that old log buildings when they were looking for a site, helped them, everybody helps everybody else. They all fell so much in love with that land, they wanted to buy part of it. So this guy come in and bought that lease, and I had option to do it. I said, there's no way we can do that, no way. He wrote him a check. He's a producer, and he bought that land, put his brand on every fence post. So he wanted some ownership on that son of a gun, and he runs bison. So, but it's fenced. I have yet to have one of those bisons out, but when I was chairman of the Board of Livestock for the state of Montana, we were concerned tremendously about brucellosis, and we still are. I helped set up the interagency bison management plan with the governor and the Forest Service and the BLN, all the partners, Forest Service out there. And our goal was at 3,500 head, things would cease, but now we're over 5 again. So we're going to harvest 5,000. But when he heard about us harvesting 5,000, this movie producer that bought that land, he come up and he really got in my face. Now, what are you doing with my bison? And I said, I bet you vaccinate your bison, don't you? Well, yeah. And I said, I wish everybody would with that brucellosis. So since then, he takes care of his bison and goes right through that forest access. You go right through his bison. So the question was, things are going to happen. Public lands, federal lands. Look at Yellowstone and Glacier Park in Montana. That's your public land. I mean, those bison are there eating that living heck out of that son of a gun. And I can't see how you can have basin wild ride that lives through that. And that's a decreaser. But anyway, that's a whole different deal. We won't get into that. But it's change. You just got to be on the road or be in the ditch. So let's be on the road. We got stuff to tell, but it's public federal land. So you remember we got a lot of people sitting at the table. So
And
let's do it.
Bob, I think that puts a pretty nice bow on it, right? All of you are here in the room today to hear not only about the realities of their operations, but the opportunities and challenges that factor into their management on a daily basis, that factor into their decisions, when they are looking at an allotment, trying to prevent standing dead timber, trying to prevent catastrophic wildfire, trying to prevent cheatgrass or vent knot or other invasive species encroachments. The decisions that they make are not just their own, right? You make a decision for your private ground, for your cattle, for your sheep, for your bison. But these producers are also making decisions for the public. They're making decisions with the agencies to make sure that these landscapes are able to persist over time. They manage and they support other active management because they would much rather, I think all of us would much rather, the picture on the left rather than the post-fire challenges on the right. They manage for the cultural resources too. Certainly, they run a business. They run profitable and sustainable businesses that depend on that forage and that piece of the puzzle working together. But they also manage cultural resources as well. When we talk about what people think about the American West, often it's the cowboy, right? There's a reason that the cowboy is the center of a lot of the tourism, the international tourism ads in the country. It's either cowboys or Yellowstone or the Redwoods, our big public land features. And they do that because it matters for the next generation. Not necessarily just their families, right? But for the next generation of hikers, the next generation of people who are going to eat the meat and wear the wool and be on those landscapes who should have an ethos. Not all of you in this room are producers, right? You could fill this room with producers and it still would be fewer and it would be a smaller room than we would have needed 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The grazing community, the ranching community, like a lot of communities, is shrinking over time. And while I often tell our producers to go and have 15 more kids, right? We need to get after it. The reality is that the advocacy for these issues, the advocacy for the landscape, is going to have to come from our partners if we're going to have more of them. And that's why these cultural resources, these natural resources, this is why the three of them came from far west to talk to Eastern producers, to talk to partner groups, to talk to people who may never have been on a BLM allotment about the values that all of us need to share for carbon, for clean air and water, for healthy wildlife, and for our nation's food supply. And I can't really say it any more than that, and so I'm gonna let one of our producers say it. I think you saw a little short teaser video for Mr. Sims in Wyoming. I'm gonna show you the full video now because his words, his experience is not different than the three of these, but you just see it from a really cool drone.
It's a wild history. The American West, where years ago stories of fame and fortune were sold down the rail line. The rush for gold, land, and opportunity largely passed through places like this. Too dry, too rocky, too harsh. Those who did stop here, like my great-great-grandfather, saw the promise of what this land could be. They learned how the earth spoke and taught me to listen. My family and I made a life here, but the land isn't all mine. We are surrounded by public lands owned by federal agencies. Ranchers like me and my family are the ones who take care of these vast spaces. There are 640 million acres of public lands across the West. They are part of the daily lives of ranchers like me, but also enjoyed by people from all over the world. Keeping these lands open for the public may not have been the original intent of the federal government, but over time, these vast, open spaces have become the core identity of this country. Hundreds of wildlife species make their homes here. The native grasses have deep roots. They guard against erosion while sustaining wildlife and our livestock. While they may not look like much, grasses like these are the largest store of above and below ground carbon in North America. Even in dry years, like this one, the soil is alive with millions of organisms that are the foundation of healthy, resilient landscapes. Ranchers like me have leveraged our ancestors' wisdom with the newest science and technology to make sure all of this lasts for the next generation. That future is threatened every day. Topsoil lost in landslides. Grasses devastated by grasshopper invasion. Every year, it's something new. I've seen fire wipe out entire landscapes. Our grazing reduces the buildup of dry grasses that make these fires so catastrophic. This year is as dry as I've ever seen it. Our range improvements bring water to the landscapes where there otherwise would be none. Our investments make life possible for wildlife and public land more enjoyable for everybody. Public land use has changed over my lifetime. Here, recreation has exploded over the last decade. There are more people who want to access these lands, often not understanding that their actions can have lasting consequences. But a little thought and careful instruction can make all the difference. We have to make sure our impact is positive and lasting. These lands represent hundreds of years of history, investment, and success. They are the promise of a future that includes the range scientist, sheep herder, and the next generation. These lands may not belong to me, but we fight for the future of these landscapes every day. This is the best of the American West, a living history and inheritance for all of us.
And so I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions because, when we're talking big themes, we're talking about, the big picture impacts and challenges and perceptions of producers, of land managers, even of federal agencies. We don't get into the nitty-gritty like NEPA, right? The evaluations, the environmental assessments that have to be done. We don't get into the Taylor Grazing Act or the Federal Land Management and Policy Act that provides some challenges. But we also don't talk about specifics for opportunities either. So what questions do you have for these folks who live it every day? Yes, ma'am.
I think it was Brenda mentioned grazing, not grazing coalition, but grazing co-op. Could you explain that to somebody who's not?
Yeah, so we don't have a
Grazing association.
Grazing association. So grazing associations used to be more common, I think, in the West than they are now, but we still have one. What established in our area was there were a number of there were a number of smaller permits that came up for sale, and some smaller producers decided that they would all get together and buy some private land that went with these permits, and they developed a grazing association. And it's set up as a legal entity with shares. So your shares allow you so many animal units, AUMs, and so you have to buy into it. And again, when I was talking about, probably get tired of hearing that, but when we were looking at ranches, all of this computes, and that's another thing when Caitlin was talking about that aspect. Those ranches will sell for something different if the permit is not attached to them. And the Grazing Association, as an entity, also holds some permits. And so that plays into that big landscape, which is much bigger than our personal, as far as if that were to dissolve because the permits weren't viable, then you've got that. But a grazing association there's a number of, I think we have 12 in ours, and everybody has a certain number of shares, and we assess ourselves every year to pay our bills and run it like a business.
And then if I can ask
Of
a
course.
follow-up question, that may seem really simple, but I'm sure there's a lot of logistics that go along with that. How do you work out?
So
There's the $50 question.
Yeah.
So, we have bylaws, so we're incorporated. We have arguments from time to time because, as I mentioned before, ranchers are very independent and your business operates differently. So we have a spring meeting before turnout, we have winter meetings, and we just resolve them. It's very much like sitting down at the family table when you've got differences, you know, and talking generation. That's one of the things you have to be willing to let go and let that change try sometimes. And so in the Grazing Association, we have bylaws to fall back on. We have AUMs, everybody's assessed the same amount, and by the share they get that. So, and then we've never had to do it in our position in this, but previous history, maybe 50 years back, they did have to bring an attorney in, just like a referee, to settle some differences. So it's like any business. When you have partners and you're operating, and then also if shares end up being sold, it has to be approved. The Grazing Association members have first right of refusal. So you can't just have your producer come and decide they're going to run buffalo. It has to be agreed upon. And the Grazing Association members, if somebody decides to get out, could increase their shares if they decided to do that. So that's a good kind of safeguard there. On the same token, we have had to deal with some people who maybe didn't treat the land in the fashion that the Grazing Association, the majority, felt that it needed to be treated, maybe a rest rotation, that type of thing. And so there's some self-policing on that for the healthy landscape. That's a tough one too, but you have to bring that conversation forward, because if we are reduced on a BLM permit because an individual is grazing on that, it affects the entire AUM capacity of the Grazing Association. So we've had some tough conversations on, you know, hey, maybe we need to rest this and change up some rotations. So that is a change. Back to the question that Caitlin asked about changes we've seen. Before a lot of this came about, everybody just went and did their own thing. On some of the land, it's taken, you know, a good 15 years to get it back into real good production, but it paid off with those few years of changes. So it is a little bit of a challenge, but it's also a big win in the long run. You know, for a couple hours of a tough meeting, it's really funny because even some of those tough nuts to crack will come back and say, man, this country looks really good.
probably
They
have
never
time.
apologize, but no. but it is nice to see that
Yeah.
come back. So
Well, and you prioritize that healthy landscape, not only for the benefit of the other members of your grazing association, but for that longevity too. It requires that thinking ahead too, in that planning. We probably have time for one more question before we adjourn. Yes, ma'am. Hi.
I'm Sasha Jeanette. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I manage our national grazing lands program. And so thank you for putting this together. And my team, our program is, you know, we're all about the story of working lands, the values, natural resources, and the collaboration. I think there's been an increase in the last few years, almost like a speeding up of the story of the opposite story from what we see here. I live near an urban area, and more what we hear is the the impacts, the methane, the beef is bad narrative, and it is just skyrocketed. And so, I'm a range scientist and range management person, but also work for a conservation organization. And so my question to you is, what additional pieces of this story can we collaboratively tell about public lands, but also about the resource benefits? Is there something? I mean, maybe it's not even something to answer right now, but it's like, what else do we need to do?
So one of the things, and I know Public Lands Council has this, I opened up National Grazing Coalition. The first thing I see is the economic, the social, and the economic capacity, ecological. The economic aspect gets back to that landscape, and the social gets into the wildlife, the water, the carbon sequestration, and the ecological gets to that same thing. So if you take away whatever myths have been out there about cattle are bad, grazing's bad, that's what we've got to focus on. Is it's a three-legged stool, and if you take that away, it's going to affect your urban aspect when they go out to see what they're seeing right now. So I almost look at it as having the conversation about if it's not there, then what's going to be there, who's going to take care of it, because this gets back to the public lands, federally managed. Okay, so people feel that they have the right to go. I've actually had people say, it's my public lands, I can do whatever I want. Well, that's like a small child, it's my birthday, I can do whatever I want. It's like, that's not how it works. So I think that we have to talk about that too, that the federal government cannot do the management, cannot do the fuel load reduction, the water developments. If we were to be off of that range that we're on, there would be in 3 wild horse herd management areas, and they're not big, but they're there. There's no water developments that would be taken care of because the federal government, the BLM, does not have the funding for that. That's the same for wildlife. So I don't have the magic bullet answer, but it's almost been like the beating of the drum mantra, and I don't know how to reverse it other than to partner with people like yourself or get out of your comfort zone and go to some of those. I mean, I've talked to Toastmaster clubs or the city club in Boise, not my most comfort level. I've gone to the Boise Public Library to talk to conservation groups, really not my most comfort level. But there were some people that came right at me, so the very things that you're saying. But there were 10 for those 2 that wanted to come and hear, and we've actually had some conversations and developed some educational workshops, tours type things. So there's no easy answer, but
I've seen some of what you're talking about too, and there's pretty much a well-funded agenda that somebody can throw a lot of stuff at to get that agenda taken care of. But let me ask you this: how do you perceive us as a range scientist or a person loving range? What is there something else we could be doing? What fire can we put out other than showing what we do?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think the showing what you do and communicating, and I think the more that we can have a consistent way of talking about the resources and the benefits, and not overdoing it too. I think sometimes we all, in a good-hearted effort, kind of go beyond and say, well, there's never any problem with cows. I mean,
We don't want to be a narcissist. We want to have people.
so I think that transparency, that communication, that you're, the stories, and then also, is there more, just a consistent way across the industry to talk about the ecological, economic, social benefits? I think that's, and I think it's partly like the U.S. Roundtable is trying to do that, and there's a lot of efforts, I think, in that direction. the more that there can be that kind of cohesive story where people are on message basically, so it's not so confusing to urban consumers.
All right, Brenda, last thoughts.
The coalitions are really, I think, a good place to start with that, because they bring in the diversity of, you know, maybe Ducks Unlimited is my thing and ranching isn't, but if we can message with some of those, because, and don't throw anything at me, Caitlin, because dues-based, agenda-based, if it's a money-based aspect, that's that agenda. But we all have to advocate for what we're doing, and that's what Public Lands Council, we have to have that advocacy. But through the coalitions, we can say, we agree on this message, we agree on this fact, we agree that this is important to the landscape, the social, economic. That message is exactly, that is the strength in what you're saying, is bringing that strong message. And I think this grazing conference is doing it. But we've made some really unlikely coalition partners on different things that have leveraged more. And if there's certain things that we disagree on, or if there are some bad actors or where we have to acknowledge that. I mean, everything's not rosy, but on the messages we can agree on, I think that's been really strong. Caitlin, wouldn't you say?
No, I agree. And you know, as we're wrapping up here, I'll turn to Nels for his last thoughts. You know, I think that consistent message, but also the message coming again from our partners who are speaking. You know, I often joke, right? As a trail runner, I have much more credibility when I'm in my running shoes and shorts than I do when I'm in boots and jeans. Your credibility, your internal and your intrinsic credibility is important. Your credibility with your, you know, with your internal communities is important, but also building those partnerships, building that consistent message, which PLC has appreciated doing with TNC over the years and will continue to do so. So Nels, your final thoughts?
Okay, I'd like to make a comment on your question. One of the things that I see that we have a real problem with, and it's a really hard nut to crack, is to educate the public to understand that when they're doing a 60-mile-an-hour ocular survey of the range over here and they see a fence line contrast in the forage, that doesn't mean that the one side is overgrazed and the other side is properly grazed. They don't know what they saw there because it's a snapshot in time. And that's a really a tough one to get to people. And I haven't been able to figure out how to do it outside of taking them out on the ground and showing them, and then show them the plans that we put together and the rotations that we put together. And sometimes it's to hit an area really hard for a specific reason, but then we stay out of it for a long period of time to allow it to come back. But they never, you know, they say, oh gosh, that's bad, that guy's overgrazing, and we all automatically start in a deep hole and have to dig our way out of that. And I don't know how you do it, but it's a tough nut. And with that,
Consistent messaging, continuing to tell the same story, the good story, and continuing to hold these values central. I think that pretty much sums it up. Thank you to all of you for coming to chat with us today. Nels and Brenda and Bob and myself will be here throughout the rest of the week and look forward to meeting in person. Thank you.
Thank you.